My name echoed through the auditorium sharp against the lights, and I walked across that stage hoping to see them. 8 chairs with my last name waited in the family row. All 8 stayed empty. No wave, no nod, not even a shadow. Just silence staring back at me while every other family screamed their pride into the air. I laughed once quietly and kept walking. 8 months passed. Then my $5 penthouse hit the real estate headlines, and that's when the first message finally arrived: family dinner. 6 p.m. Important discussion. I showed up, but not the way they expected. My name is Nora Mitchell, and for as long as I can remember, I learned to take up as little space as possible in my own family. Not because anyone said it outright, but because the rules were already carved into the walls of our house long before I understood how families were supposed to work. Elise, my older sister, was the bright one, the girl who never had to ask twice. Ryan, the youngest, was the one everyone protected even from the consequences he created himself. And me, I became the quiet gap filler, the steady pair of hands, the person who stepped in whenever someone else stepped out. The pattern started early. I remember Elise leaving her science project at home the morning it was due. She burst into tears at the door, and my mother panicked as if the world were ending. Without thinking, I offered mine, the one I'd spent a week building. Elise won second place. No one asked why I didn't turn in anything. Mom just said, "See, Nora always figures things out as if it were praise instead of dismissal." Years later, when I got my first part-time job, I saved up to buy a small set of drafting tools, my first real investment in the dream I was too shy to name. Before I could open the package, Dad asked if he could borrow the money for a bill Elise forgot to pay. "You're responsible," he said, already pocketing the cash. "She has a good heart, just needs time." I nodded because nodding was easier than arguing. Even birthdays followed the same script. One year, I baked a cake for everyone, chocolate, the kind Mom liked. When Elise arrived late carrying a box of store-bought cookies, Mom kissed her cheek and said, "You always think of the sweetest things." I stood there holding the cake server, realizing I had been erased without anyone noticing. But the memory that binds it all together, the one that still sits like cold metal in my chest, came years later in that tiny studio I could barely afford. Winter. No heating. I was wrapped in 2 jackets, leaning over my chipped desk, revising a floor plan for a duplex I hoped to renovate. Payments spread across the table, rent reminders blinking on my phone. I called Dad not for money, just advice, just his voice. He answered, but not gently. "Real estate is for men who understand numbers, Nora. You should try something safer." Then he hung up. That night, the stitching on my black portfolio tore open. I didn't throw it away. I sat under the weak light of my desk lamp and sewed it shut by hand, the needle shaking each time I pushed it through the fabric. That portfolio became the only thing that stayed with me through every project afterward. And then came graduation. My name echoed through the stadium applause, rising like a wave. I turned toward the family section, toward 8 chairs with little cards showing my last name. All 8 were empty. They hadn't forgotten. They had chosen not to come. And that was the day I understood exactly where I stood in my family. 8 months slipped by after that ceremony, quiet, clean months where no one said my name unless they needed to compare it to someone else's. I worked, I saved, I signed whatever deals I could reach, and I didn't tell my family a single thing. Silence felt safer than offering them something they could overlook again. One afternoon, I was sitting in my Honda outside a job site, letting the engine hum under my hand while I reviewed a revised valuation. A notification slid across my screen, an article forwarded from a colleague I barely remembered. I opened it without thinking. Local developer's $5 million penthouse makes real estate headlines. My name was printed right under the headline, bold against a photo of the building I'd rebuilt inch by inch. The article listed numbers, timelines, the renovation process, projected returns. My phone buzzed with more links, more congratulations, none from my family. I set the phone face down on the passenger seat, staring through the windshield as the late afternoon clouds pulled over the sky. For a long moment, I didn't feel proud or relieved. I just felt still, like the world had paused to see what I would do next. Then the phone vibrated again. This time, the name on the screen wasn't a colleague. It was my father. The message was short, direct, written exactly in his tone. No greeting, no softness. Family dinner at 6 p.m. Important discussion. No, how have you been? No congratulations, just a summons. Another message followed. Don't be late. I held the phone between my fingers, feeling the weight of 8 silent months pressing through the glass. This wasn't a reunion. It was a transaction dressed as family. I didn't breathe for a moment. Then, in the familiar rhythm I'd learned long ago, I inhaled once through my nose, let my shoulders settle, and typed the only answer he deserved. I'll be there. I dropped the phone back onto the seat, started the engine again, and watched the streetlights flicker to life as the sky shifted toward evening. Whatever they wanted from me, they had already shown me something more important. They only remembered me when the world did. The message stayed on my screen long after the engine stopped rumbling beneath me. I sat there in the fading light, my hands still on the wheel, the cold plastic buzzing faintly from the vibration of one more notification, another article, another forwarded congratulations. The world suddenly had a lot to say. My family, after months of silence, suddenly did too. But I didn't drive home. Not yet. Instead, I pulled into the small lot behind my office building, a place no one from my family had ever bothered to visit. The sky was sinking into that bluish gray that always made Seattle feel quieter than it really was. I locked the car, climbed the stairs, and let the heavy door close behind me. Inside, the familiar hum of the fluorescent lights settled into my bones. I set my black portfolio on the desk, the same one I'd stitched by hand years before. The seam was still there, crooked in one corner, a reminder of a night I spent sitting alone, telling myself that one day I'd have something worth putting inside it. I opened it slowly. Paper brushed against paper, contracts, valuations, spreadsheets, progress reports, my entire life organized in signatures and dates. Not one sheet owed anything to my family. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel triumphant either. I felt precise. I turned on my laptop, and the room filled with the soft whirring of the fan. My fingers moved automatically, checking the project ledger, reviewing payments, highlighting the line items that would close in the next 6 weeks. Numbers steadied me in a way people never had. Email, spreadsheet, signed, filed, archived, deleted. Each action landed like a quiet heartbeat. At 6:42 p.m., I stood and crossed the room to the long window overlooking the city. The building across the street had already turned on its interior lights, making its glass glow in a soft amber grid. My reflection hovered there, blazer creased from work hair, tied back exhaustion sharpening my jawline. It was a face that had earned every inch of the $5 million penthouse the article mentioned. I watched my reflection breathe. I hadn't done that in a long time. My phone vibrated on the desk. Another message. Not from my father this time, someone from a firm downtown wanting to congratulate me on the penthouse. I let it buzz. 10 seconds later, another message. A reporter requesting a quote. Then another. My phone became a nervous animal rattling across the wood. I flipped it over and turned off the sound. Silence returned. This was what mattered, not their noise. My plan was already in motion. I sat again and pulled out the acquisition file I had finalized that morning, the one for the commercial plaza that had taken 4 months of negotiations, dozens of site visits, and far too many late-night calls with inspectors. It was without question the most important purchase I had ever made. It also wasn't lost on me that the plaza was a key piece of almost every major development plan in the district. I didn't know officially that my father and Gerald wanted it. But real estate is a small world, especially in a city shaped like Seattle. You hear things when you work quietly, when you don't brag, when you keep your head down and listen. I ran my fingers along the edge of the final signed page, tracing the ink I had pressed into it only hours earlier. They wanted me at dinner. They wanted something from me. Something big. I didn't need a confrontation. I needed clarity. I reread every clause, every footnote, every closing condition. Then I slid the entire packet into the black portfolio, pressing it flat with the palm of my hand. The action felt like sealing a door. By the time the office clock blinked to 7:19 p.m., the windows had faded into a deep navy. I reached for my coat, then stopped. The coat felt unnecessary, too soft, too personal. I left it hanging and walked out with only the portfolio in my hand. The hallway lights clicked off behind me as I moved. Outside, my Honda waited its faded paint, catching what little streetlight it could. I unlocked it, placed the portfolio in the passenger seat, and slid behind the wheel. For a moment, I watched the city breathe traffic, easing lights, flickering wind, riffling through the last leaves of early autumn. Everything I had built came from this silence. As I pulled onto the freeway, the city spread out ahead of me like a map I had already memorized. I drove past the buildings I'd renovated, past the corners where I'd once stood waiting for buses, 'cause my family never offered to pick me up past the bridge where I'd walked home more times than I wanted to remember. Every landmark felt like a tally mark. Here's where they weren't, and here's where I learned to live without them. The portfolio lay still beside me. I brushed my fingers against the stitched seam. I didn't rehearse what I would say at dinner. Words had never worked with them. They talked over apologies, talked past explanations, talked through every boundary I ever tried to draw. So I stopped trying. This time I wouldn't bring anger. I wouldn't bring explanations. I would bring proof. When I reached the turn toward my parents' neighborhood, I slowed the car. The houses lined the street like well-behaved witnesses, quiet, trimmed identical. Porch lights clicked on as the sun disappeared behind the hill. I pulled into their driveway at 6:59 p.m. My father would appreciate the punctuality. The house glowed in that familiar heavy gold. Through the dining room window, I saw silhouettes moving, Elise leaning forward, Ryan gesturing, Dad pacing. None of them knew what was sitting in the passenger seat of my car. I opened the door, stepped out, and adjusted the collar of my blazer. One slow breath in, one steady breath out. They wanted an important discussion. Fine. I had something important, too. The front door opened before I could knock. My father filled the frame shoulders squared like he was greeting a client instead of a daughter he hadn't spoken to in 8 months. "You're right on time," he said, stepping aside. No hug, no warmth, just approval for punctuality. The dining room was already full. Elise sat straight-backed, swirling her wine. Ryan leaned in his chair, fingers tapping the table. Gerald adjusted his tie like he was preparing for a board meeting. My mother hovered behind her chair, smiling too hard. I took the seat farthest from the head of the table. The one left open intentionally, an empty space they'd decided was mine. Dad cleared his throat. "Let's get straight to it. We have an opportunity on the table." Gerald leaned forward, clasping his hands. "A warehouse district redevelopment. Valuable land, strong projections. We're ready to move, but we need Capital I finished." They didn't even flinch at the bluntness. Dad nodded. "Yes. We thought this could be a family partnership. You come in with funding, we guide the project. Everyone wins." Elise lifted her glass. "It's generous, honestly, considering how new you are to all this." Ryan snorted. "Yeah, you'd get to learn from real experience." My mother placed a hand on my arm. "Sweetheart, this is a chance to be part of something bigger than yourself." I let their words spill into the room, one over the other, overlapping like static. Not a single sorry, not a single acknowledgement. Just their plan wafting through the air like the smell of the roast cooling on the table. I reached for my black portfolio and set it down. The sound, soft controlled, cut through the conversation like a dropped coin. The room stilled. "I did come for an important discussion," I said quietly. "Just not yours." Dad frowned. "Nora, we don't have time for—" I unfastened the portfolio and opened it. A stack of documents, clipped and ordered, slid into the candlelight. Gerald leaned forward, his brow tightening. "Is that the commercial plaza?" I said. "The one every development firm has been circling for months." Dad inhaled sharply. "You're exaggerating. That property isn't even available." I looked at him. It was. 4 months ago. I placed the signed acquisition documents on the table. Their names reflected faintly in the glossy pages. Elise stopped breathing. Ryan's chair creaked under him. My father's jaw clenched so tightly the muscle jumped. Gerald reached for the pages with trembling fingers. "You bought it," he whispered. "The entire plaza." I nodded once. "Which means your warehouse district project has no anchor property, and no anchor means no funding, no approval, no investors." Dad finally found his voice. "Why would you do this? You knew we were going after it." "No," I corrected. "I knew the city was going after it. And unlike you, I don't wait for opportunities to come to me." My mother's voice cracked. "Nora, we're supposed to be a family." "A family shows up," I replied. "You skipped my graduation. You skipped my life. But you didn't skip the headlines." Silence expanded across the table, thick and unmoving. I gathered the documents, slid them neatly back into the portfolio, and closed it with a soft click. "You wanted an important discussion," I said. "This is it." Dad's shoulders sagged. Elise looked down at her plate. Ryan mouthed something like a curse, barely audible. I stood adjusting my blazer collar the way I always did when I was done explaining myself. "Dinner's yours," I said, "but the future, that's mine." No one followed me as I walked out. They just sat there finally quiet. The night air felt colder than I expected when I stepped outside, sharp enough to cut through the thin fabric of my blazer. The porch light behind me hummed quietly, flickering the way it always had when I was growing up. I stood there for a moment, letting the warmth from the house fade off my skin. Then I walked to my Honda, opened the door, and slipped inside. The cabin smelled faintly of old upholstery and the vanilla air freshener I kept meaning to replace. I rested both hands on the steering wheel, letting my breath settle. Through the windshield, I could see the front window of my parents' dining room, shadows moving, someone gesturing, someone else sinking into their chair. I couldn't hear a single word. That silence felt earned. My phone buzzed once on the passenger seat. A message from my mother. "We didn't know how to make things right. Please don't give up on us." I didn't open the thread. I didn't delete it either. I just turned the phone face down and started the engine. The drive home traced the same streets I'd taken 1,000 times past the corner store where Elise once made me wait in the cold while she talked to friends past the park where Ryan used to brag about how Dad never let him fail past the hill that always looked bigger when I walked it alone at 16. Each place looked smaller now, like they belonged to someone else's memories. When I reached downtown, the city lights rose to meet me, white gold steady. My penthouse building stood at the end of the block, its glass facade catching the glow of the street lamps like a lighthouse. I parked, rode the elevator up, and unlocked the door. The quiet inside was nothing like the quiet at my parents' house. No tension clinging to the walls, no unfinished sentences hovering in the air. Just space clean open mine. I set the portfolio on the kitchen island. The stitched seam caught the light, casting a thin shadow across the marble. I traced it with one finger, remembering the cold night I'd sewn it shut in a studio apartment with no heating. Back then, the silence felt like punishment. Tonight, it felt like clarity. I crossed to the floor-to-ceiling window and leaned my forehead against the cool glass. The city stretched out below me, calm, endless, honest. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to explain myself to anyone. I finally understood silence isn't what hurts, it's who breaks it. I looked out over the city one last time, the windows reflecting nothing but my own outline, steady, unbent, finally mine. All my life, I kept saving seats for people who never showed up, leaving room for apologies that never came. Now I understood something simpler. Boundaries aren't cruelty. They're quiet doors we close so our lives can breathe again. I turned off the lights, letting the room fall into a calm, earned darkness. If you've ever rebuilt yourself in the silence someone left behind, tell me where you're listening from. Some stories begin the moment we stop waiting.